Welcome to Staff Work Explained. Are you here for the first time? Please consider subscribing to this channel. In this video, we'll be talking about the Dangote crude oil refinery puzzle. How did Kenya go from silence to groundbreaking? So we look at that. So when President William Ruto first announced that Aliko Dangote was considering building a major oil refinery in East Africa, the story seemed straightforward. The proposed location was Tanga, Tanzania. It was presented as a regional project that would serve several East African countries and strengthen the region's energy security. Within days, however, the narrative began to change. Tanzania President Samia Suluhu Hassan publicly questions why a project supposedly designed or destined for her country has been announced without her knowledge. Not long afterwards, Dangote himself stated that Kenya had become his preferred destination because it offered strong commercial advantages, among other things. Then came another shift. The conversation was no longer about Kenya in general, but about Lamu specifically. Soon after that, financing discussions were started. An implementation committee had been formed, and President Ruto spoke of an eminent groundbreaking ceremony for a project that could rank among the largest industrial investment in Africa. The transition appeared remarkably fast. That sequence of events raises legitimate questions. What happened before the public became aware of the project? Was Lamu always the preferred destination? Why did Kenya's president initially advocate for Tanga? Why was Tanzania seemingly caught off guard? And how far had preparations already progressed before the first public announcement? These questions deserve careful examination, not because they prove that anything improper occurred, but because understanding how projects of this magnitude move from concept to execution is essential to understanding what the public is actually being told. Let's start by looking at the story that the public saw. The public timeline begins in April 2026 during the Africa We Build Summit in Nairobi. President William Ruto announced that East African countries were discussing the construction of a regional oil refinery in Tanga, Tanzania, with Aliko Dangote expected to lead the investment. The proposal was described as a collaborative regional project involving Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, South Sudan, and Democratic Republic of Congo. On the surface, it sounded like a major breakthrough for regional integration. Yet, one important element appeared to be missing. At that stage, no publicly available feasibility study has been released, no detailed investment framework had been presented, there had been no official confirmation from Tanzania that it had accepted hosting the refinery. More importantly, the host country's own president had not publicly endorsed the proposal. For projects worth between $15 and $20 billion, such omissions are unusual. Investments of this scale typically follow a structured process involving preliminary engineering, studies, environmental assessment, land identification, commercial renegotiations, and formal government approvals before political leaders publicly announce this project. Instead, the announcement appeared to come before many of these feasible milestones. That alone does not indicate anything improper. Major investments often involve confidential negotiations long before they reach the public domain. However, what happened next made the situation considerably more intriguing, and that is President Samia's response that changed the entire conversation, at least when looked from a different angle. Only days after the announcement, President Samia Suluhu Hassan publicly revealed that she had questions President Ruto about the announcement. Her concern was not that Tanzania opposed the refinery. Her concern was that a refinery plan for Tanzania had apparently been announced before she had been formally informed. That distinction is extremely important. Diplomatic disagreement between head of states over communications are uncommon, especially regarding investment of national significance. Her reaction immediately suggested one of several possibilities. Perhaps discussions had been taking place below presidential level and had not yet reached final political stage. Perhaps President Ruto announced ongoing negotiations earlier than Tanzania considered appropriate. Or perhaps Tanga was still one of the several competing locations rather than a confirmed destination. None of these possibilities can be confirmed from the available public evidence. Nevertheless, President Samia's response demonstrated that the process was far less settled than the initial announcement suggested. Then, Dangote changed the direction. The next major development came not from the government officials, but from Aliko Dangote himself. Rather than reinforcing the earlier focus on Tanzania, Dangote began publicly describing Kenya as a strong commercial choice. Initially, attention centered on Mombasa. Later, they shifted decisively towards Lamu. His explanation remained markedly consistent. Kenya offered better commercial conditions, stronger logistics, an established petroleum trading ecosystem, superior infrastructure, and closer access to regional market. Notice what Dangote did not say. He never publicly suggested that Tanzania had rejected the project or that political disagreement had forced him elsewhere. Instead, he consistently framed the decision as a commercial evaluation. That distinction matters because investors generally prefer to present location decisions as business choices rather than political victories or defeats. Then, the president supported Tanga while the investor preferred Kenya. One of the most fascinating aspects of the entire story remains largely unexplained. Why would Kenya's president publicly support Tanga while the investor later declared Kenya to be the preferred destination? Several explanations deserve consideration. The first is that President Ruto may have been promoting a regional political compromise rather than expressing Kenya's own commercial preference. Kenya already hosts East Africa's largest petroleum trading hub through Mombasa. Tanzania, meanwhile, is home to major energy infrastructure linked to the East African crude oil pipeline. Locating a refinery in Tanzania could have distributed strategic assets more evenly across the region while still benefiting Kenya through regional fuel supply. A second possibility is that Dangote technical team simply reached different conclusions after conducting deeper commercial analysis. Site selection for industrial projects do not depend on a single factor. Engineers and financial analysts examine shipping cost, port capacity, access to crude supplies, pipeline connectivity, electricity reliability, environmental constraints, insurance cost, labor availability, taxation, and long-term expansion opportunities. An early preference can change substantially once detailed technical evaluations are completed. A third possibility is that Tanzania's internal approval process had not progressed as far as initially assumed. President Samia's reaction could indicate that uncertainty still existed within the government structures. Investors generally avoid uncertainty because it increases financial and political risk. Each of these explanations remain plausible. None has been conclusively proven. Now let's look at why Lamu eventually emerged. Once attention shifted to Kenya, another question emerged: why Lamu? From a project development perspective, the answer is relatively straightforward. Lamu already sits at the centers of Kenya's long-term LAPSSET development strategy, which aims to transform the region into a major logistics and industrial corridor. Unlike Mombasa, Lamu offers significant room for future expansion. Large refineries require far more than processing equipment. They often become the center of entire industrial ecosystems that include fuel storage terminals, petrochemical plants, fertilizer production, plastic manufacturing, shipping facilities, and supporting industries. Such developments require extensive land, deep water port access, and room for future growth. Lamu offers all three. The location, therefore, aligns with long-standing national development plans rather than appearing as an entirely new concept. Then, fast-forward effect. Perhaps the greatest source of public curiosity is not where the refinery will be built. It is how quickly the conversation appears to have advanced. Within a relatively short period, public statements began referring to financing structures, engineering preparations, implementation committees, soil investigation, and even expected groundbreaking ceremony. For many observers, this created the impression that every significant decision has already been made before the public became aware of the project. That perception is understandable. Projects of this scale normally involve years of technical preparations. However, there's another explanation that fits equally well with how major investments are managed. Most large infrastructure projects spend months and sometimes years moving through confidential commercial stages before government make any public announcement. These stages often include preliminary engineering assessment, confidential financial modeling, early environmental screening, commercial negotiations, legal reviews, and investor due diligence. Due diligence simply means a systematic investigation carried out by investors to confirm that a project is technically feasible, financially viable, and legally sound before committing billions of dollars. By this time, political leaders speak publicly. Much of this background work may have already have been completed. In other words, the public is often introduced to a project long after the project itself has taken shape. Are the remaining processes merely formalities? That's a question that one may ask. This is perhaps the most sensitive question. Public statements referring to site selection, implementation committees, groundbreaking ceremonies naturally create the impression that all major obstacles have already been removed. Legally, however, significant processes still remain. Environmental and social impact assessment must satisfy regulatory standards. These assessments examine how a project may affect surrounding communities, wildlife, water resources, and local livelihood before approval is required. Land acquisition must comply with legal procedures. County governments still have statutory responsibilities. Environmental regulators, port authorities, water agencies, infrastructure providers, and other institutions each retain approval roles. Political support can certainly accelerate coordination between government agencies. It cannot legally eliminate statutory requirement. Whether these processes become straightforward because government strongly supports the project is a different question. The existence of a political commitment should not be confused with the completion of every legal obligation. Now let's look at the questions that still matter. Although much has become clearer, several important questions still remain unanswered. When did Dangote first begin evaluating Kenya and Tanzania? That's important. At what point did Lamu emerge as the preferred location? Who first proposed Lamu? Is it the Kenyan government or Dangote technical advisors? Was Tanga even or ever genuinely close to becoming the final destination, or was it simply one option among several throughout the evaluation process? How much preliminary engineering work had already been completed before the first public announcement? And finally, how far has environmental approvals, land arrangements, and financing actually progressed beyond what has been publicly disclosed? These are not accusations. They are legitimate questions that naturally arise when governments announce projects measured in tens of billions of dollars. In conclusion, we can say that the Dangote refinery story illustrates how large infrastructure projects can appear to emerge almost overnight, when in reality they are often the product of months or years of confidential planning. Viewed through the lens of project management rather than political headlines, the sequence begins to make more sense. Preliminary commercial discussion, technical screening, investor evaluation, and government engagement frequently take place long before the public sees the first press conference. By the time political leaders speak, investors may already have completed substantial groundwork behind closed door. Even so, the public timeline leaves genuine gaps. The transition from Tanga to Lamu happened unusually quickly. President Samia Suluhu public response exposed clear differences in communication between governments. Dangote's commercial preferences for Kenya contrasted sharply with President Ruto's earlier endorsement of Tanzania. Finally, the rapid movement from public announcement to discussion about financing, implementation structures, and groundbreaking created the impression that the project had already advanced well beyond what was publicly acknowledged. None of these developments proves that established procedures have been bypassed or that outcomes have been predetermined. The evidence currently available does not support such conclusion. What they demonstrate is that much of the refinery stories unfolded outside public view long before citizens were invited into conversation. As more information becomes available, attention should shift away from political deliberations towards the measurable milestones that define projects of this scale: completed feasibility studies, environmental approvals, financing agreements, land acquisition processes, engineering contracts, as well as regulatory compliance. Those milestones, not speeches, will ultimately reveal how this project moved from an idea discussed in private to what now appears to be one of Africa's most ambitious industrial development. So thank you for reaching this far. If it's your first time here, please consider subscribing to this channel. You can also watch other videos that we have done on this project and others in Africa, as well as different parts of the world. So thank you, and let's meet in the next one.